Hello everybody, welcome back to class for the asynchronous session. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the next two chapters that you should have read for class today, chapters 3 and 4 from Progressive Dystopia. I'm going to focus on the big picture stuff to make sure that those things are clear and unpack those some. And then in the discussion board, I want you to take it from the big picture to the concrete and really focus on the ethnographic materials and the specificity of the ethnographic examples and vignettes and details, and see how you can and try and take those and pull them out to connect the small scale to the big scale. Before continuing, though, I think it's important to talk a little bit about prison abolition. And I'm not going to create a whole history or framework for this concept or social movement. Instead, I just want to kind of introduce it and make sure we all kind of have an idea of what we're talking about. And if it's something that y'all want to talk about more, I'm very open to having that conversation in class. I would do better with y'all asking me questions for clarification points for things you don't understand or are curious about, and I can do my best to answer them as a conversation. But prison abolition is a social movement focusing on the abolition of the prison industrial complex. Prison abolitionists say that prisons are unnecessary and they are detrimental and violent, and that we are better off without them. One of the most prominent prison abolitionists and theorists within the movement is Angela Davis. And I've given you two videos in this clip of Angela Davis talking about prison abolition, just to give a kind of introduction if it's something you want to learn a little bit about. It's pretty basic stuff that she's talking about. I really am trying to just make sure we're all on a same basic page here in terms of understanding what this is about. There's plenty more longer videos if you want to watch Angela Davis espouse her brilliance in long form. But when we talk about abolition, right, the first thing you might notice is there's a kind of taking of this language of abolitionism from the plantation era, for lack of a better word, taking this kind of movement to eradicate slavery in the 1800s and 1700s, and taking that into the 21st century, thinking about abolition as as abolishing prisons. And in this language, right, where there's an argument being made, right, the argument is that prisons are a continuation of the plantation system. They are a way of enclosing populations and capturing and holding populations captive and extracting labor from them. They are a mechanism of control and social death, or removing people in the similar way that we talked about from last class or last Tuesday, a way of removing people from political life and social life, citizenship, and owners of private property. And what prison abolitionists say is not only is this system of the prison industrial complex a continuation of the plantation, right? And here it's easy to point to, or it's important to point to, disparities in terms of the over-incarceration of black people as well as people of color and indigenous people, as well as impoverished people. It's also important to, and I also just want to mention the book, The New Jim Crow, right, which makes a historical argument saying that prisons take up this role of capture and incarceration in a way that really gets upscaled and turned into what we would now call mass incarceration as a way of, when Jim Crow gets disestablished, in the same way Jim Crow functioned to reinscribe white supremacy and captivity and control in a post-emancipation world, mass incarceration does the same thing in a post-Jim Crow world. Now, when we talk about prison abolition, there's a couple key points just to iterate really quickly. Abolition is not the same as reform. Reformists want to make prisons better. They want to provide things like provide prisoners with better educational resources while they're in prison. They might want to make living conditions in prisons more humane. They might want to limit torture practices like solitary confinement. They might want to provide, inmates with financial counseling or ease the transition upon release. We can think about reform as focused on rehabilitation, the idea of taking people who have been incarcerated and helping them become what I think reformists would say as productive members of society. Abolition is not reform. Abolition is saying we need to get rid of prisons. We don't need to make them better. We don't need to make them humane. They are inherently sites of violence and captivity and anti-black racism. They are inherently sites of state violence, and we don't need them. And instead, the idea is that all of the things that prisons are supposed to do, we need to develop different kinds of institutions that can do those things better. So instead of, for example, incarcerating people for theft, we could say, why are people stealing, right? And the underlying conditions, why do people steal things? Well, the underlying condition is pretty generally poverty. So instead of dealing with the behavior, can you deal with the underlying root, which is usually class, race, gender. And here we can also think about reparative versus retributive justice. Prisons are retributive justice. The idea is that people who commit what are called crimes need to be punished. And justice means punishment. It means retribution. I say people who are said to commit crimes because the concept of a crime is socially constructed. There's a great meme going around the internet lately that points out, like, if you need an example of this, right? If you steal something from a cash register at work, if you steal money, you go to jail because that's theft. But if your employer steals money from you by not paying you your wages that you're entitled to, that's not a criminal offense. That is something else that you file a complaint. I forget exactly how, but it's not a criminal complaint. So even though both are theft, right, when it's people in positions of structural power, it's considered not criminal. So that's why I say things people we would call criminal or behave in criminal ways, right? In the sense that criminality is always socially constructed. Reparative justice is about repairing the social fabric. It's about figuring out what went wrong, who was hurt, and how do you bring people back into good relations. Now, this is a complex set of issues, which we can continue talking about more in class, but I've already been talking on this slide for 7.5 minutes, so I'm just going to stop there. It's a really fascinating field of social movement and social theory if you're interested in learning more. And so I wanted to pull out the two questions that I see coming up again and again in these two chapters. When I was reading it, these are the patterns that I was seeing. There are more dynamics here. This is just what I'm pulling out. The first one is, how does Robeson, as a progressive win, both challenge and reproduce anti-black practices, capture and enclosure? This is the core contradiction proposed in the first chapter, right? This is that opening contradiction, and here Jean-Jay is going deeper into it, is going deeper into these issues. The second pattern that I saw again and again was students refusing these practices of progressive governance, refusing things like the lesson plan, refusing participation within this kind of liberal multicultural dystopia, and instead thinking about students' everyday practices as an embodied abolitionist politics, as a kind of small-scale, everyday way of refusing to be incorporated within the status quo, even if it's the progressive status quo. Another issue that came up in both chapters is this distinction drawn between freedom on the one hand and emancipation. And I've given you these two quotes, which you can read from one from each chapter, where these concepts are really unpacked. And essentially, the idea in this book, the framing is that emancipation is less radical than liberation or freedom. Emancipation is about freeing youth from enclosure in the first quote. In the second quote, it's about formal inclusion within the late liberal state. So right when we talk about emancipation in 1863, we're talking about a moment where enslaved people were freed, and so that they could be better incorporated into a post-slavery liberal settler state. Freedom, on the other hand, or emancipation, freedom or liberation, on the other hand, Jean-Jay is talking about this as something deeper. It requires abolishing the conditions that produce enclosure. It requires, and the second one she just calls freedom liberation. But the idea is that we have to go deeper, right, into an abolitionist politics, something that is about abolishing the conditions that generate non-freedom, that generate enclosure, that generate captivity, in a way that goes beyond simply incorporating people into a liberal state. So in chapter 3, Jean-Jay says that the thesis of the book, or of this chapter, is to take Sophia's Spanish class as a lens into the progressive side of what she's calling carceral, sorry I can't pronounce that, progressivism, the carceral progressivism paradox. And the idea is that Sophia's class is deeply informed by anti-racist pedagogies, what she calls a pedagogy of coalition. The idea is it's not just about building consensus within your class. The idea is being that consensus is kind of flat and you come to a shared agreement with everyone. Coalition is more working, it's more partial, right? And one of the dynamics that comes up in this Spanish class is the formation of Black Chicana solidarities. And that's about coalition, not consensus. So we have this kind of deeply anti-racist practice, right, where Sophia is really working actively, and there's many examples of this throughout the book, throughout the chapter, to offer these kinds of spaces of coalition or solidarity, to shape course materials in a way that advances these kinds of anti-racist practices. And this chapter talks about a number of different things, including structural changes in education, the elimination of the letter grade D, because while D was considered a passing grade for high school in California, it did not meet requirements for college admission within the California State University system, or the University of California higher education system. And so just by getting rid of D, right, it's about simplifying that, making it more, removing that ambiguity for students. And this chapter also does a lot with play in the classroom, the kinds of verbal games and jokes that students make. You may also notice a lot of eulogies in the footnotes. I don't have a way of talking about those as a professor, and I'm hesitant to really integrate the death of the people that Jean-Jay was working with, the children that she was working with, into a kind of like lesson plan. In the same way, I think she's hesitant to integrate it into an argument in her book, but she also wants to acknowledge that her research is haunted by these systems that systematically produce Black death. And so going back to this kind of site of thinking about the progressive side of carceral progressivism, thinking about Sophia's class as this progressive side, what this chapter really argues are these kinds of 2 points, where on the one hand, in progressive, I'm sorry, not so much 2 points as much as a contradiction, where on the one hand, progressive politics usually lauds education as a social good. It's something that gives you economic mobility, and it can even be a direct antidote to mass incarceration. The idea is that if you get if you give people better educations, then they are less likely to go to jail. Now, there's a number of problems with this. In the first place, because it places blame on individual behavior, right? We need to educate individuals so that they are less likely to go to jail, as opposed to we need to abolish prisons as an inherently unjust system that is part of a larger system of captivity and anti-black unfreedom. And the second piece that contradicts this is because everyone is talking about the importance of education as the antithesis, as an antidote to mass incarceration, it's easier to ignore the school's own investment into disciplinary practices, the ways in which the school site functions as a site of captivity, the ways in which especially black bodies and especially black women's bodies are disciplined at Robeson. And so there's a lot of educators are talking about what's called the school to prison pipeline. And this includes Robeson faculty and leadership. And the school to prison pipeline is basically a critique of the ways in which low income, largely black and people of color schools are over militarized and policed through things like metal detectors and putting the presence of police in a way that systematically criminalizes black and POC bodies. In a way that, and doing this, it's a kind of logic that essentially takes these kinds of disciplinary practices and extends them and prepares students. It's basically about criminalizing student bodies, right? It's about criminalizing them in a kind of preparation or a way of targeting people or habituating people into incarceration. But Jean-Jay is actually kind of critical of this idea of the the school to prison pipeline. She thinks it doesn't help, it actually obscures the anti-black racist dynamics that are happening. It's not deep enough. And her problems with it is that on the one hand, it presumes that prisons are an immutable fact of the landscape. If we're doing a lot of activism around demilitarizing schools and removing police from schools, that's important. But it's not enough just not to have a pipeline from the school to the prison. We need to have an abolition of prisons. When we talk about schools to prison pipelines, it tends to be masculinist. It tends to be a narrative that focuses on the pipelines or experiences of black boys as opposed to black girls. And black girls' experiences and pathways to prison are not identical to those of boys. And the last piece is that the metaphor of a pipeline actually erases the kids' agency and self-determination. They are simply raw materials, raw resources that are shuttled around by state infrastructure. They don't have any agency on their own within this metaphor. And as an alternative, Jean-Jay offers us two separate metaphors. The first, instead of the pipeline, we can talk about enclosure. How do schools and prisons enclose black social, cultural, and political life? So here we're talking about the physical buildings themselves, the enclosing of bodies into classrooms, into prison cells. It's not insignificant here that the architectures of prisons and the architectures of schools are very similar. They function very similarly. Both these architectures are just very efficient at controlling populations from the top down. But also we can think about it as the enclosure of social, cultural, and political life, right? There's a whole dynamic, which I'll talk about a little more later, about what could be considered appropriate behavior or inappropriate behavior. And what's considered inappropriate is always racially coded. For example, things like volume of voice, which may be perfectly appropriate in a number of communities, in a number of Black communities, may be policed within the context of a classroom and may be disciplined. Students may be written up or sent or put in detention or something like that because of being loud in a way that's perceived as disruptive, as opposed to appropriate behavior within Black cultural norms. The second piece of the metaphor, not pipelines, but pathways. Pathways foregrounds agencies because people move through pathways. They aren't simply shuttled around like raw materials. Pathways can be good because Robeson does accomplish broadening the range of outcomes for Black students. This is a common sense social good. However, pathways also limit terrain. It predetermines how and where we can move. In the same way a sidewalk or a road does. It directs our movement in certain ways and limits us from moving in other ways. Remind me to talk about dérivé at some point, which is a whole social practice of learning to move through the landscape in ways that are counter to the ways that the architecture is trying to get you to move through it. It's about using land in alternative ways to the kinds of top-down models of how we should move through space. The last piece is pathways are really what Sanjay calls a technology of self. It's a way of building students, building teachers, a way in which students and teachers are able to construct understandings of themselves, construct lives, construct who they are as people. But it's a technology of the self. It's a way of constructing the self that is very much in conformity with the existing status quo. Right? At Jobson, there are pathways that lead to places other than prisons. There are pathways that lead to higher education. But that pathway is something that exists that's very compatible with the existing social order. It doesn't disrupt or abolish that social order. And the title of the chapter comes from this phrase that a student asks in Spanish class: why can't we learn African? And Sanjay says that it would be easy to say, oh, well, that's a silly question, because obviously there's many different African languages, and it's off topic from the class anyway. But she wants to take that question seriously. Why can't we learn African? And her point, right, is that for African Americans, that is the point of heritage, the point of ancestry, is Africa. And that has to do with the specific history of erasure, of disrupting and silencing the more specific genealogies and inheritances. That would have to do with more specific languages, more specific peoples. So why can't we learn African? Well, many African languages do not have adequate teaching resources that are available for English speakers or English-speaking teachers. Swahili is a widely spoken language, and there are a lot of teaching materials for Swahili, but that is not a language that qualifies for a state teaching credential in California. So there's certain institutional barriers here. There's also a dynamic in which slavery has marked a loss of access to specificity, right? Specificity. There are over 2,500 languages spoken in Africa, and how do you claim any heritage language as a Black person in the United States, as an African American person in the United States, when you don't have access to knowing which of these 2,500 languages your people spoke? Your family, I'm sorry, that was a Southern thing, your family spoke. Your ancestors. And then there's also this point that Sanjay brings up, which has to do with the colonial histories of the region, right? In which there's more French speakers in Africa than in France. And so if you learn French, you can actually move through large portions of Africa. So there's a whole political system, right? And Sanjay is really interested in this question, why can't we learn African? And actually taking it seriously, not just kind of laughing at it as a silly question, but taking it seriously as a question. And she also notes, right, it's important that the student doesn't ask, can we learn African? But why can't we learn African? And in this chapter, we see again and again students utilizing play, making jokes in a way that subverts the lesson plan, right? So you have the teacher who creates this anti-racist curriculum. And then you also have these black students that are subverting that curriculum, subverting that lesson plan through these kinds of acts of play. And I just think that's such an interesting dynamic. Now, one of the really interesting quotes that I've been thinking about a lot is when Sophia, the teacher, says, this is about abuelita, you can't make jokes about slavery. That's so inappropriate. And here, Sophia's comment is not simply a reflection of white liberal norms, right? Because she has her own background in Chicana communities and movements and multiracial, multicultural movements. And yet, there is still this politics of what is appropriate or inappropriate that is defined from the perspective of this kind of multicultural set of norms that actually excludes abuelita's practices of being black. And so there's this lovely quote, Sophia's anti-black practices are interrupted by abuelita's mode of black practice. This is the friction between anti-racism and abolition. And I love that. That would be actually something that would be lovely to talk about more in the context of the discussion forum, is this last piece, the friction between anti-racism and abolition. What a lovely quote there. And Sanjay says that why can't we learn African? That question is a roadblock on the progressive pathway. She's really into these institutional metaphors, and I love it. Infrastructural metaphors. The question is a defiance of the best case scenario of left politics. Abolition is the unreasonable, the irrelevant wilderness that exceeds and undermines any infrastructural attempt to develop its land, even in the service of revolution. I just fucking love that quote so much. And so what we see here in this chapter and in the next one is Sanjay is attending to students' practices of disruption, practices that are often coded as problem student behavior even, if not some disruptive in the best case scenarios, and looking at that and seeing in these a kind of a black practice and a black politics that is at its core abolitionist, that's based in a kind of refusal to participate within the status quo. It's about asking questions that exceed the kinds of cultural expectations of the classroom, right? Questions with no easy answer in the context of a introductory Spanish curriculum. And so I love this contradiction between Sophia's anti-black practices, her anti-racist practices, and the ways in which these are interrupted by the students' modes of black practice. What a lovely contradiction. And by lovely, I mean interesting. And by interesting, I mean it tells us so much, so deeply about the ways in which liberal, progressive, anti-racist practice can actually reproduce anti-black structures. Or even, maybe that's too hard of a way of putting it. Maybe it's just simply the ways in which blackness exceeds the limits of liberal, progressive statecraft, even anti-racist statecraft. And so in these two chapters, we're looking at the school as another site of captivity. And literally students are required to go to school. They are captive at school. And so chapter 4 then shifts to pay attention to the space of the school, and specifically the hallway, the space of the hallway. And this is what Sanjay calls a geography of captivity and fugitivity. By geography, she means space. And the hallway sits at the intersection of state control and the body, right? There are these regimes of state control of discipline. You're supposed to be in class. You're supposed to be paying attention. You're not supposed to be like fucking off outside in the hall. And then the body, right? Because this is how state power works, is it's not just abstract, it's enacted on our bodies in specific locations, in specific places. This chapter covers faculty, staff talking about conversations about problem students. It talks about a staff meeting about de-escalation and proper behavior towards students in a way that de-escalates rather than escalates. And of course, these issues, right, and especially the issue of problem students, are always racially coded. As Sanjay notes, the students who are coded as problem students are overwhelmingly black. And so here, this chapter argues that the commitment to racial equity fails to the extent that Robeson faculty and leadership continue to see themselves in their schools working outside the bounds of systematic racism, rather than always ensconced within them. So here, what Sanjay is saying is that even though the school has this commitment to racial equity, that commitment fails because the school, the people working in that school, see themselves as somehow being outside of racism, of structural racism. They see themselves as separate, as exceptional from these systems of racism. And this makes it hard to see the ways that the school is already enmeshed within anti-black racist practice. On a more theoretical and abstract level, one of the points that Sanjay is making in this chapter is that the plantation is neither absolute nor trapped in the past. What she means by that is plantations are spaces not just of death and entrapment and capture, but also black life in ways that do matter. I did not mean to make that pun on purpose, but I guess it works. It's not a site of absolute total control or capture. It's always that those systems of power are always partial and negotiated. And this is what Sanjay talks about as the tension between captivity and fugitivity. Nor is the plantation trapped in the past. The plantation is not something that happened a long time ago that was bad and is now over. The plantation is a social logic that orders it's an organizing principle of our society. And the way that Sanjay talks about this is she wants to rethink the space-times of captivity as well as black futurity. She wants to rethink the relationship between past and present, the plantation and the school, in ways that aren't encompassed within linear time, that aren't encompassed within this kind of neat separation of past and present. And she argues that doing that is absolutely necessary if our goal is to build black futures. And the other piece that's really lovely is she's interested in how students seize time, right? Because part of what being at school is, and part of how the state operates and how capital operates, is by taking your time. Time here, we can also talk about life, right? Because life only exists in time. So like we're talking about hours of your life that are seized by factories or places of work or by the school. And so the question for Sanjay is, how do students refuse these seizures? How do they reappropriate their time? How do they refuse state control over their time, even in the context of a progressive institution or a progressive state, an anti-racist state? And this is what Changé talks about as idleness as an abolitionist tactic. She says in an institution geared towards winning progressive reforms, idleness delegitimizes the game itself. Idleness is again a way of taking one's time back. So I guess what I would say, like in the context of social movements and progressive movements, right, Robeson can be considered a win. And yet we see certain pieces of certain students, student parts of the student body, who are engaged in this practice of idleness as a way of taking their time back from these state-mandated systems of capture, of captivity. Idleness is about playing a different kind of game. It's not about winning or losing. It's not about winning or taking control over state resources. It's a different kind of game altogether. And so the concepts that Changé uses here that I think are really powerful is she talks about refusal. This is going to come up in Mohawk Interruptus, the next book we're going to read, in a very big way. The refusal to be incorporated within the liberal settlers, within the liberal state. Refusal is an act of saying no. It's playing a different kind of game altogether. Fugivity, right here, she's referencing movements. I'm sorry, that's not the right word. She's referencing the history of becoming fugitives of the plantation, right, of self-emancipation. And uncivil disobedience, right? In contrast to the history of civil rights and civil disobedience, she's interested in uncivil disobedience. And I think these are just nice concepts that help us to think through these practices in good ways. One last point, because we were talking about apocalypse, I wanted to pull out this quote from the book. One of the teachers, Kate, talks about the importance of disciplining students when they're being, quote-unquote, misbehaving in the halls, or not doing what the state mandates them to do or what the teachers mandate them to do. She talks about it should be the apocalypse. And what she means by there is she means like she wants teachers to take these students and like hand their asses to them. But what Changé says is Kate may have been right when she said that it should be the apocalypse, the end of the world, for students to be in the hallway. But what she may not have realized was that it was her world as she knows it that they're hinting towards ending. It's the end of her world as she knows it. It's the end of the liberal, the progressive, carceral state. This is what Changé talks about as an anti-politics. It is not geared at seizing control over the state. It is about abolition. It's about finding fugitive spaces, however fleeting and small they are, in your everyday practices as a way of existing beyond these technologies of capture, beyond the pathways of the school, beyond the enclosure. Even if you're still within it, right? You're physically still within the hallways. You are enclosed even as you are resisting these systems of enclosure. And the quote continues, these ratchet young fugitives spatialize the abolitionist imperative of uncivil disobedience and remind us of the painful naivety of respectability as a strategy for black citizenship. It is not about it's not about becoming a respectable citizen. It's not about becoming incorporated within the liberal state. It's about finding fugitive spaces for existing otherwise. It's about uncivil disobedience. So like last time, these are the discussion questions that I've proposed. If you need structure, if you need specific questions to answer, or if that's helpful, read through these and answer that. But if there's something you're aching to talk about from the book that I have not asked about in these questions, absolutely 100% write about that in your discussion posts. I think that is phenomenal. I love it when you have issues or questions or concepts or anything that you want to talk about that I hadn't thought to ask about. I love that. That's great. You should do it. That's great. But when you're answering these questions, the way that I've created the structure that I have, this optional structure for you, is I'm trying to get y'all to think through the specificity of the ethnography, as I said in the beginning. Whereas I'm kind of pulling out the abstract concepts because I want to make sure those are clear. The work I want y'all to do in the discussion is then to think about the concrete specifics of the ethnography. How do we tie these abstract things down to students and staff members' everyday lives? How do we tie it down to the ethnographic particular? So the first question is about pulling out specific vignettes or details that stood out to you. And how do we get those ethnographic particulars to speak to the big picture issues? The second question has to do with Sanjay's argument about the state as inherently anti-black, as a set of anti-black practices. So how does the state operate in the context of these two chapters? How does the state operate in the context of Robeson? How do different factions seek to reincorporate black life into the liberal state? How do they seek to resist the status quo? What are the limits? Are there limits to incorporating black bodies into anti-black practices? But this is really about identifying through ethnographic concrete examples, what does Sanjay mean by the state as a set of practices organized around anti-blackness, organized around the plantation? The next question is about idleness and humor. How do we understand idleness and humor as a kind of embodied politics? Or maybe it's an anti-politics. Sanjay uses both. I don't think it's not an either-or situation. It's anti-politics in that it's contrary to what we normally think of politics in the sense of progressive movements. And the last piece is, what do you make of Savannah Sanjay's writing style and choices? She does incorporate a lot of Black English phrases, the footnoted eulogies. What did you make of these kinds of practices? All right, and with that, I will see you guys on Wednesday.